My ex-husband's perfect new girlfriend thought she had successfully framed me for a $40,000 diamond theft, until my nightmare mother-in-law stepped forward with a recording that changed everything. They say that when a marriage ends, you're supposed to feel a sense of closure once the ink on the divorce papers finally dries. For me, that ink had been dry for 18 months, but the ghost of my life with Mark still haunted the corners of our small town. We hadn't had a bad divorce per se. There was no cheating, no hidden gambling debts, no dramatic blowout in a courtroom. We had simply drifted into different versions of ourselves until the bridge between us collapsed. Or so I thought. I had spent the last year rebuilding. I poured my soul into my boutique interior design firm, finally gaining the traction I needed to land high-end clients. I had a small, loyal circle of friends, a cozy apartment that didn't smell like Mark's cigar habit, and a sense of peace I hadn't known in a decade. I was moving on. But the thing about small towns is that you don't just move on, you move in parallel lines with your past. Then came Tiffany. Mark met her 3 months after our divorce was finalized. She was a lifestyle influencer with a penchant for white marble, filtered photos, and a passive-aggressive streak that could cut through tempered glass. From the moment they went public, she seemed obsessed with my existence. It started small. She'd post photos in my favorite coffee shop with captions like, "Finally finding the hidden gems in this town that some people clearly overlooked." Then, she started showing up at the gym where I'd been a member for 5 years, always managing to snag the treadmill right next to mine, whispering loudly into her phone about how some women just don't know when to let go of the past. I ignored it. I really did. I took the high road until the pavement started to crumble beneath my feet. The real trouble began when I was hired to lead the design committee for the town's annual Autumn Heritage Gala. It was the biggest social event of the year, a black-tie fundraiser that could make or break a local business's reputation. For me, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. If I pulled this off, my firm would be set for years. I was in charge of the theme, the vendors, and most importantly, the silent auction, which featured items worth tens of thousands of dollars. I was 3 weeks into the planning when Mark and Tiffany's names appeared on the donor list. Mark had never been one for charity events. I used to have to drag him to them, kicking and screaming. But Tiffany clearly saw this as her debutante ball. She didn't just want to attend, she wanted to be involved. She used Mark's family connections to worm her way onto the hospitality subcommittee, which meant she was constantly in the same meetings as me. Every meeting was a battlefield. If I suggested deep forest greens and gold accents, Tiffany would chime in that it felt dated and heavy, suggesting instead a minimalist cream palette that would have looked like a hospital hallway. She would look at my sketches and sigh, a soft, pitying sound that made my blood boil. "It's just so brave of you, Sarah," she said during one particularly grueling session, her voice dripping with fake honey, "to keep working so hard after everything. Most women would have retreated to a quiet life after losing a man like Mark. But here you are, trying so hard to stay relevant." The room went silent. Our mutual friends looked at their laps. Mark, who was sitting at the back of the room waiting for her, didn't say a word. He just looked at his phone, refusing to meet my eyes. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but I kept my voice steady. "This isn't about Mark, Tiffany. This is about the library fund. Let's stay on track." I thought that would be the end of it, but Tiffany was just warming up. As the gala approached, things started going wrong. Small things at first. A florist I had booked for months suddenly called to say they'd been told the event was canceled. A shipment of custom linens went missing, only to be found in a dumpster behind the community center 3 days later, ruined by bleach. I had no proof it was her, but the smug smile she wore every time we crossed paths told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just trying to annoy me anymore. She was trying to sabotage my career. She wanted me to fail publicly, to look incompetent in front of the very people who were considering hiring me for their own homes. The night of the gala arrived. The ballroom was stunning. Despite Tiffany's best efforts, I had managed to pull off a Midnight in the Enchanted Forest theme that had the board members beaming. I was wearing a floor-length emerald silk gown, feeling for the first time in a long while, like the woman I used to be before my marriage dimmed my light. I was standing near the silent auction tables, checking the bid sheets, when I saw them enter. Mark looked handsome, but uncomfortable in his tuxedo. Tiffany, however, was a vision in a white gown that looked suspiciously like a wedding dress. She was glowing, commanding the room, whispering in the ears of the town's most influential figures. I watched her move toward the table where the centerpiece of the auction sat, a rare vintage diamond brooch donated by the town's matriarch, Mrs. Sterling. It was worth $40,000 and was the crown jewel of the night. Tiffany lingered by the brooch for a long time. I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach, but I was pulled away by the mayor, who wanted to congratulate me on the decor. For 30 minutes, I was swept up in the duties of a host, shaking hands and accepting compliments. I almost allowed myself to relax until the scream echoed through the ballroom. "It's gone! It's gone!" The music cut out abruptly. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and there, standing by the empty display case where the diamond brooch should have been, was Tiffany. She looked frantic, her hands trembling as she pointed at the velvet-lined box. "I saw her!" Tiffany cried out, her voice amplified by the sudden silence. She turned her tear-filled eyes toward me, her fingers shaking as she pointed directly at my face. "I saw Sarah hovering over the case just a few minutes ago. She was acting so strange, so nervous. I didn't want to believe it, but she's been so bitter about the divorce, so desperate for money to keep her little business afloat." The room turned to look at me, 100 pairs of eyes ranging from shocked to judgmental. I felt the world tilt on its axis. "Tiffany, what are you talking about?" I stammered, stepping forward. "I haven't been near that table in 20 minutes. "Liar!" she shrieked, pulling a small, shimmering object from the folds of her dress, but not the brooch. She pulled out her phone. "I saw you put it in your clutch. Mark, tell them. Tell them how she used to hide things when she was angry." Mark stood frozen, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. But he didn't defend me. He looked at Tiffany, then at the crowd, and then he let out a heavy, rehearsed sigh. "Sarah, if you have it, just give it back. We can settle this quietly." My heart shattered. He was going along with it. He was going to let her destroy me. "I don't have it!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Search me, search my bag. I have nothing to hide." "Oh, we don't need to search you," Tiffany said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous purr as she stepped closer, "because I saw exactly where you slipped it when you thought no one was looking. It's not in your bag anymore, is it? You tucked it into the lining of your coat in the cloakroom." The head of security, a man I had known for years, looked at me with a pained expression. "Sarah, we have to check. For the sake of the event." We marched toward the cloakroom, the crowd following at a distance like a funeral procession. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely breathe. I knew I hadn't taken it, but the look of pure, triumphant malice on Tiffany's face told me that it didn't matter. She had set the trap, and I had walked right into it. The security guard reached into the pocket of my long black coat, his hand fumbling for a moment before his face went pale. He pulled his hand out, and there, caught in the light of the hallway, was the sterling brooch. A collective gasp went up from the onlookers. Tiffany let out a sob of disbelief, burying her head in Mark's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," the guard whispered. "I have to call the police." I stood there, paralyzed, watching my entire life vanish in a single moment of framed guilt. But as the sirens began to wail in the distance, a cold, sharp voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Wait just a damn minute." Everyone turned. Standing at the edge of the hallway was the one person I thought hated me more than anyone in the world. Mark's mother, Eleanor, the woman who had spent 10 years making me feel like I wasn't good enough for her son, stepped forward, her eyes fixed not on me but on Tiffany. Eleanor held up her own phone, her expression unreadable. "Before you handcuff the wrong woman," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "Perhaps you'd like to see what I recorded while I was waiting for my driver by the cloakroom 10 minutes ago." The silence that followed Eleanor's announcement was heavier than the one that had preceded it. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sudden sharp chill of a shifting tide. Eleanor didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped into the center of the circle, her spine as straight as a spear, and held her phone out toward the head of security and the mayor. Her hand was steady, unnervingly so. This was the woman who had spent a decade making me feel like a temporary fixture in her son's life, a girl from the wrong side of the tracks who had somehow tricked her golden boy into marriage. I had spent years trying to earn her respect, only to be met with a wall of polite frost. Now she was standing between me and a jail cell. "I've lived in this town for 64 years, Eleanor said, her voice carrying to the very back of the hall. "And if there is one thing a sterling woman knows, it's how to spot a performance. Tiffany, dear, you were playing to the balcony, but you forgot about the person standing in the wings." Tiffany's face had gone from a triumphant flush to a sickly, mottled gray. She reached out for Mark's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Mark, she's confused. She's always hated me. She's just trying to protect Sarah because she wants you two back together." Mark looked like he was suffering a slow-motion nervous breakdown. He looked at his mother, then at his girlfriend, then at me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, not toward me, but toward the woman he'd replaced me with. The security guard, Mr. Henderson, took the phone from Eleanor. A small crowd huddled around him, their heads bent as they watched the screen. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I watched their faces. I saw the mayor's eyebrows shoot up. I saw the indrawn breath of the local librarian. "It's quite clear," Mr. Henderson said, his voice hard as he looked up from the screen. He turned his gaze toward Tiffany. "The video shows you walking into the cloakroom with your hand closed tight. You find Sarah's coat, you slip something into the inner pocket, and then you check your hair in the mirror before walking out. All while Sarah was on the other side of the room talking to the catering staff." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. The lifestyle influencer was suddenly being viewed through a very different lens. The carefully curated image of the sweet, supportive new partner was evaporating, leaving behind something much uglier. "It's not what it looks like!" Tiffany shrieked, her voice hitting a frantic, high-pitched note. "I found it on the floor. I was just putting it somewhere safe because I didn't want it to get lost in the crowd, and I thought I'd tell the authorities later." "In her coat pocket?" Eleanor asked, one eyebrow arched in icy disdain. "You found a $40,000 brooch and decided the safest place for it was the pocket of the woman you've been publicly berating for months. That's a fascinating leap of logic, even for someone who makes a living taking pictures of their avocado toast." The crowd chuckled, a dry, mocking sound that seemed to physically shrink Tiffany. She looked around, realizing the audience she had worked so hard to cultivate had turned into a mob. "Mark," she pleaded, shaking his arm, "tell them. You know I wouldn't do this." Mark finally spoke, but his voice was hollow. "Tiffany, why were you even in the cloakroom? You told me you were going to the powder room. I got turned around. It's a big building." The sirens were louder now, the blue and red lights flashing against the tall windows of the ballroom. 2 police officers entered the foyer, their heavy boots thudding on the marble. The gala guests parted to let them through. "We received a report of a theft," the lead officer said, looking around the tense tableau. "The item has been recovered, officer," the mayor said, pointing to the brooch still in Mr. Henderson's hand, "and we have video evidence of how it got where it was found." Tiffany's bravado finally broke. She didn't cry, not real tears anyway. She began to hyperventilate, A theatrical display of distress that might have worked an hour ago, but now looked like a desperate ploy. I'm being framed. This is a setup. Sarah and Eleanor planned this to get rid of me. I finally found my voice. I haven't spoken to Eleanor in 18 months, Tiffany. How could we have possibly planned this? The officers took the phone from Mr. Henderson and watched the video. They looked at Tiffany, then at me. One of them took out a pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come down to the station for questioning," the officer said, stepping toward Tiffany. "No, you can't. Do you know who I am? Do you know how many followers I have?" Tiffany was backed against the cloakroom counter, her eyes darting around like a cornered animal. As the officer reached for her wrist, Tiffany did something nobody expected. She didn't surrender. She lunged, not at the officer, but at me. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of champagne and bile. "You think this is over because of a stupid video? I've been inside your life, Sarah. I've seen the skeletons in Mark's closet, and I know exactly which ones belong to you." The officers grabbed her, pulling her back and snapping the cuffs into place. The room was in an uproar. People were filming on their phones, the very tools Tiffany had used to build her empire now being used to document its collapse. Mark stood there, his face buried in his hands, the picture of a man who had realized he'd traded a diamond for a piece of shattered glass. Eleanor stepped toward me, her presence shielding me from the prying eyes of the guests. "Are you all right, Sarah?" she asked. Her voice wasn't warm, exactly, but the frost was gone. It was the voice of a general checking on a soldier. I think so," I whispered, my legs feeling like jelly. "Thank you, Eleanor. I don't understand why you did that. I thought you preferred her." Eleanor gave a small, sharp smile. "I may not have always been your biggest advocate, Sarah, but I have a very low tolerance for those who lack breeding. That girl is a parasite. She was draining my son's bank account and his common sense. But more importantly," Eleanor leaned in, her eyes narrowing, "she was threatening the integrity of this town's legacy, and I don't allow that." She patted my arm, a gesture so foreign it made me flinch, and then turned to walk away. But as she did, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Don't get too comfortable, though. Tiffany wasn't lying about one thing. She's been digging." Before I could ask what she meant, a commotion broke out by the entrance. Mrs. Sterling, the owner of the brooch, was standing by the display case, her face white as a sheet. She wasn't looking at Tiffany or the police. She was holding the recovered brooch in her hand, staring at it with an expression of pure horror. "This isn't mine," she rasped, her voice trembling. The mayor frowned. "What do you mean, Martha? It was found in the coat. The video shows—" "I don't care what the video shows," Mrs. Sterling cried, holding the shimmering object up to the light. "This is a high-quality cubic zirconia, a fake. The metal is silver-plated, not platinum." The room went deathly silent again. The police stopped halfway to the door with Tiffany. "If that's a fake," the officer said slowly, "then where is the real $40,000 brooch?" Every eye in the room turned back to me. Tiffany, despite being in handcuffs, let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "I told you," she screamed. "I told you she was clever. She switched them before I ever got to the cloakroom. She used me to plant the fake so she could keep the real one for herself." My heart stopped. I looked at the brooch in Mrs. Sterling's hand, then at the empty display case. Then I looked at my own hands. Just then, my phone buzzed in my clutch. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen, visible even as I trembled. "The real one looks much better on my desk than it did on that old lady's chest. Thanks for being the perfect distraction, Sarah. Check your bank account. The first installment of the hush money just cleared." The glow of the phone screen felt like a brand, searing the incriminating words into my retinas. I wanted to drop the device, to hurl it across the marble floor and pretend I had never seen it, but Officer Miller's hand was already there, his fingers closing around my wrist with a firm, professional grip. "I'll take that, Miss Thorne," he said. His voice was no longer the polite, neighborly tone of a man who had bought coffee from me for years. It was the voice of the law. He didn't even have to read it aloud. The screen was bright, the text large. Tiffany, who was being held by the second officer, craned her neck to see. When she read the words, "Hush Money," a sound escaped her, a jagged, hysterical peal of laughter that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I told you," she shrieked, her voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. "She's the one. She's been playing the victim this whole time while she stripped the town blind. She didn't just steal the brooch. She sold it and framed me to cover the trail." "I didn't. I don't even know who that is," I cried, looking desperately at the crowd. My friends, the people I had worked with for months, were backing away. The mayor looked disappointed, a far more painful expression than anger. Mark was staring at me, his mouth slightly open. "Sarah, $50,000? Is that why you were so adamant about the small divorce settlement? Because you already had a plan to take what you thought you were owed from the town?" "Mark, shut up," Eleanor snapped, though her eyes were fixed on the officer holding my phone. She didn't look at me. My heart sank. Even Eleanor, the woman who had just saved me from a false accusation, was wavering. The evidence was too perfect. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. "Officer, check the account," Tiffany urged, her eyes bright with a terrifying, manic glee. "If the text says the money cleared, it'll be there. Check it." Officer Miller looked at me. "Do you consent to showing us your banking app, Sarah? Or do I need to get a warrant and take you into custody right now?" "I have nothing to hide," I whispered, though my voice was trembling so hard I could barely form the words. "But I'm telling you, there is no money. I'm overextended on my business loans. I'm struggling. That's why I took this job." With shaking hands, I navigated to my banking app. I leaned over so the officer could see, my thumb hovering over the biometric sensor. I was so sure of my innocence, so certain that the text was a bluff, a last-ditch effort by Tiffany to cause chaos. The app opened. The blue loading circle spun for a second that felt like a lifetime. And then, the balance appeared. Available balance $52,410.82. I gasped, my knees finally giving out. I hit the floor, my silk gown billowing around me like a funeral shroud. There it was, a wire transfer from an offshore entity labeled Project Heritage, Final Disbursement. $50,000. It had arrived exactly 6 minutes ago. "Sarah Thorne, you are under arrest for grand larceny and wire fraud," Officer Miller said. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The room erupted. The midnight in the enchanted forest. Theme I had worked so hard on now felt like a dark irony. The gold-trimmed trees looked like bars. The emerald lights felt like the eyes of 1,000 judging ghosts. As I was led toward the exit, Tiffany was being uncuffed. The video evidence of her planting the fake brooch was suddenly being recontextualized as a distraction or a misunderstanding in the face of my actual theft. "Wait," Eleanor's voice rang out again. She hadn't moved from her spot. She was staring at the empty display case, her chin tilted up. "Officer, before you take her away, I want to know one thing. If Sarah is the mastermind who switched the brooch and received the payment, why would she be so incredibly stupid as to leave her phone out with notifications on in a room full of people?" "Panic makes people sloppy, Mrs. Sterling," the officer replied, though he paused. "No," Eleanor said, walking toward me. She looked me in the eyes, searching for something. For the first time, I didn't see the cold mother-in-law who thought I was a social climber. I saw a woman who recognized a setup when she saw one. Sarah is many things. She is stubborn, she is occasionally prideful, and she has a disastrous taste in men. No offense, Mark, but she is not stupid, and she is not a thief. "The money is in her account, Mother," Mark shouted. "How much more proof do you need?" "I need to know who sent that wire," Eleanor said. She turned to the head of security, Mr. Henderson. "Check the guest list again, not the donors, the staff. the third-party contractors, who had access to the auction tent this afternoon. Everyone on the committee, Henderson said, and the catering crew, and the tech team for the lighting. And the florist, a new voice added. We all turned. Standing by the buffet table was a young woman I recognized, Mia, an intern from my firm. She looked terrified, her face tear-stained. In her hand, she held a small black velvet pouch. I found this, Mia stammered, holding the pouch out toward the police. It was tucked inside the floral arrangements for the head table. I was cleaning up a spilled vase when I saw it. I thought it was just a weighted bag for the flowers, but when I opened it... Officer Miller took the pouch and opened it. He pulled out a shimmering, brilliant piece of jewelry, the real sterling brooch. It caught the light, throwing rainbows across the stunned faces of the crowd. If that's the real brooch, the mayor said, looking from the jewelry to me, then who put it in the flowers? And why was the money sent to Sarah's account? The wire transfer, Eleanor said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the hush money text again. It wasn't a payment. It was a transfer of funds from a joint account that was supposed to be closed months ago. Mark, didn't you and Sarah have a secondary savings account for the house renovations? Mark paled. We did, but it was emptied during the divorce. Was it? Eleanor asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Or did someone leave just enough in it to make a transfer look like a deposit? Someone who still had the login credentials? Every eye shifted to Mark, then to Tiffany, who was suddenly very interested in the hem of her white dress. But the tension was broken by the sound of a heavy door slamming at the back of the hall. A man in a dark suit, someone I hadn't noticed all night, a representative from the insurance company that covered the gala's high-value items, was heading for the emergency exit. "Stop him!" Eleanor shouted. Security lunged, but the man was fast. He disappeared into the night, leaving the ballroom in a state of absolute pandemonium. But as the police scrambled to follow him, my phone, still in the officer's hand, buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a call. The caller ID didn't show a number. It showed a name that made my heart stop. It was my father's name, a man who had been dead for 5 years. Officer Miller looked at the screen, then at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. He answered the call and put it on speaker. A distorted, mechanical voice filled the silence of the room. The girl was just the beginning, Sarah. If you want to know the truth about why your marriage really ended and why your father really died, look under the floorboards of the house you lost in the settlement. You have 1 hour before the cleaners arrive. The mechanical voice on the speaker didn't just chill my blood, it turned it to slush. My father had died of a sudden heart attack 5 years ago. At least, that's what the coroner's report said. But the mention of the house, the cleaners, and the 1-hour deadline sent a jolt of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror through me. Officer Miller looked at the phone as if it were a live grenade. The ballroom was a sea of murmurs, but Eleanor Sterling moved through the noise like a scythe through wheat. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. "Officer, my daughter-in-law, ex-daughter-in-law, is clearly being targeted by a sophisticated criminal element," Eleanor said, her voice authoritative. "The brooch was found. The wire transfer is a transparent fabrication using an old account. If you waste time processing her here, you're letting the real criminals get away. You heard that call. You saw that man flee." Miller hesitated, looking at the door where the insurance representative had vanished. "I can't just let a suspect go, Eleanor." "Then come with us," I shouted, the desperation breaking through my voice. "The house is only 10 minutes away. If we don't get there, whatever is under those floorboards will be gone, and we'll never know who is behind this." Mark stepped forward, looking pale and confused. "Sarah, what is this? What floorboards? We lived there for 7 years. I never saw—" "You never looked, Mark," I snapped. "You were too busy looking at yourself in the mirror." Eleanor didn't wait for permission. She began walking toward the exit, dragging me with her. Miller signaled to his partner, and within seconds, we were a convoy. Eleanor's sleek black sedan led the way, with Miller's cruiser right behind us. Mark and a hysterical Tiffany followed in his SUV, Tiffany still shrieking about her ruined reputation and the insanity of the night. Inside Eleanor's car, the silence was suffocating. She sat beside me, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Why are you doing this, Eleanor?" I whispered. "You spent 10 years wishing I'd disappear." She didn't look at me. "I spent 10 years wishing you would grow a backbone, Sarah. My son is a weak man. He seeks out women he can dominate or women who can flatter him. You were the former for a while, and Tiffany is the latter. But your father was a man of integrity. He worked for the Sterling estate for 30 years as our lead auditor. When he died, things shifted in our family business. Things I didn't like." My breath hitched. "You think his death wasn't an accident?" "I think he found something," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "And I think someone has been waiting for the right moment to make sure whatever he found stays buried. They used the gala, the brooch, and that vapid girl, Tiffany, to distract everyone while they moved in on the house. The House of Thorn, as my father had jokingly called it, sat on the edge of the historic district. It was a charming Victorian that I had poured my heart into, only to lose it in a divorce settlement that Mark had fought for with uncharacteristic ferocity. Now it was their house. As we pulled into the driveway, the clock on the dashboard showed we had 38 minutes left. The house was dark, but as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The front door was slightly ajar. "Wait," Miller cautioned, drawing his weapon. "Stay behind me." We entered the foyer. The house smelled different. Tiffany had replaced my lavender and beeswax scents with a cloying, expensive floral perfume. We moved toward the study, the room where my father had spent his final hours helping me with my business taxes. "The floorboards," I whispered, pointing toward the heavy mahogany desk that Mark had insisted on keeping. "Under the rug." Mark and Tiffany burst in behind us. "This is breaking and entering," Tiffany cried, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She looked around the darkened room, her eyes darting toward the shadows. "Mark, make them leave." "Tiffany, shut up," Mark said, his voice surprisingly firm. He was looking at the desk, then at me. "Sarah, what are we looking for?" I knelt on the floor, pushing aside the heavy Persian rug. I found the seam in the oak planks, the one my father had always told me was a quirk of the old house. I pressed the knot in the wood just as he had shown me when I was a child, a trick for hiding emergency candy. The board popped up. Below, it wasn't candy. It was a heavy, waterproof pelican case. Miller stepped forward to help me heave it out. It was locked with a heavy-duty padlock. "I have bolt cutters in the cruiser," Miller said, turning to head back out. "No need," I said, my fingers trembling as I reached for the locket I always wore, the one with my father's picture. Inside the back of the locket was a tiny, flat key. He had given it to me on my 25th birthday, telling me to keep it for a rainy day. I didn't think he meant a hurricane. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. I threw the lid open. Inside were stacks of documents, but they weren't just audits. They were photographs. Photos of the fleeing insurance rep, Mr. Vane, meeting with someone in a dark parking lot. There were ledger pages with highlighted entries showing millions of dollars being funneled out of the town's heritage fund, the very fund the gala was meant to support. But it was the last thing in the box that stopped my heart. It was a handwritten note from my father, dated the day before he died. "Sarah, if you're reading this, I didn't make it to the meeting. The rot goes deeper than the estate. It's in the blood. Don't trust the Sterlings, not even—" The note ended there, a smudge of ink trailing off the page. "He was a whistleblower," I whispered, tears blurring my vision. "He was going to expose the embezzlement." "And he did," a cold, smooth voice said from the doorway. We all spun around. Standing there wasn't the insurance rep. It was the mayor, flanked by two men in dark tactical gear, the cleaners. They weren't holding mops. They were holding suppressed submachine guns. "The mayor!" Mark gasped. "Arthur, what are you doing?" "Protecting the town's future, Mark," the mayor said, stepping into the light. He looked regretful, but his eyes were like flint. "Your father-in-law was a prying old fool. He didn't understand that sometimes funds need to be redistributed to ensure growth. And Eleanor always was too suspicious for her own good." The mayor looked at the two men. "Collect the box and eliminate the witnesses. We'll make it look like a tragic domestic dispute. Disgruntled ex-wife, a jealous new partner. The story writes itself." Tiffany let out a strangled sob, collapsing against the wall. Mark stepped in front of me, a rare spark of courage in his eyes, but it was useless against the weapons pointed at us. "Wait," Eleanor said, stepping forward. She didn't look afraid. She looked disgusted. "Arthur, you really think you can kill me in my own town? You think the Sterling name ends with a domestic dispute?" "The Sterling name is a shell, Eleanor," the mayor sneered. "And tonight, it finally breaks." One of the gunmen stepped forward, raising his weapon toward Eleanor's chest. My heart thundered in my ears. This was it. But then, the sound of a heavy engine roared in the driveway. A set of headlights swerved, shining directly through the study window, blinding the gunman for a split second. Thump, thump, thump. 3 red laser dots appeared on the mayor's chest, steady and unblinking. From the darkness outside, a voice boomed through a megaphone, but it wasn't the police. It was a voice I recognized from my childhood, a voice that belonged to my father's brother, the black sheep uncle, who had disappeared into government work decades ago. "Arthur, you have exactly 5 seconds to drop the hardware before my team turns this library into an indoor shooting range," my Uncle Silas growled. The gunman froze. The mayor's face went from triumph to absolute terror. But as the standoff reached its breaking point, Tiffany suddenly lunged, not for the door and not for safety. She grabbed the Pelican case and threw it toward the open fireplace, where a small decorative fire was still smoldering from earlier in the evening. "If I'm going down, you're all going with me," she screamed. The case hit the grate, the plastic beginning to hiss and melt instantly. The documents, the only proof of my father's murder and the town's corruption, were seconds away from being lost forever. But as I lunged for the fire, Eleanor grabbed my dress, pulling me back with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. "Let it burn, Sarah," she hissed in my ear, her eyes wide with a frantic, hidden meaning. "You don't understand. The box isn't the evidence. The box is the bait." Suddenly, the floor beneath us groaned. A sharp, mechanical beep began to echo from somewhere deep within the walls of the house. "The 1-hour deadline," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. It wasn't for the cleaners to arrive. Eleanor gripped my hand, her face pale. It was for the house to be erased. The beeping was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't coming from the Pelican case melting in the fireplace. It was coming from the walls themselves. "Everyone out, now!" Uncle Silas's voice boomed again, no longer through a megaphone but from the shattered remains of the study window. The next few seconds were a blur of violence and motion. The 2 cleaners raised their weapons, but they were too slow. 2 muffled thips echoed through the room, and the gunmen slumped to the floor, neutralized by Silas's snipers before they could pull a trigger. The mayor turned to bolt, but Officer Miller tackled him into the mahogany desk, the heavy wood groaning under their weight. "The case!" I screamed, lunging toward the fireplace. The plastic was bubbling, black smoke curling into the room. If my father's legacy burned, the truth died with it. "Sarah, no!" Eleanor's voice was a whip crack. She didn't grab my dress this time. She grabbed my shoulders and shoved me toward the door. "The box was a diversion, you fool! Your father knew they would come for it. Look at your locket." I stumbled into the hallway, my fingers flying to the silver locket. In the chaos, I hadn't noticed that the tiny key I'd used to open the Pelican case had a small, glowing LED on its head that was now blinking in sync with the house's countdown. "It's a proximity trigger," I realized, my voice rising in panic. The key, it's not just a key, it's the failsafe. We scrambled out of the front door just as the beeping reached a frantic, continuous whine. Uncle Silas was there, his face weathered and grim, ushering us behind the reinforced steel of his tactical SUV. Mark was dragging a sobbing, hysterical Tiffany by the arm, throwing her into the grass just as the world turned into fire and thunder. The explosion wasn't a massive fireball. It was a controlled, implosive charge. The House of Thorn, the place where I had grown up and the place I had lost, didn't blow outward. It collapsed in on itself, the walls buckling and the roof dropping into the foundation in a cloud of dust and pulverized timber. The cleaners were gone. The evidence in the fireplace was gone, and my history was a pile of rubble. I sat on the cold pavement, gasping for air, the smell of cordite and old dust stinging my throat. Mark was on his knees a few feet away, staring at the ruin of his home. Tiffany was curled in a ball, her white wedding dress stained with soot and grass, her influencer persona shattered beyond repair. The mayor was being led away in double cuffs by Silas's team, his face a mask of defeated rage. "It's over," I whispered, the weight of the night finally crushing me. He won. The mayor won. Everything my father found is under 1,000 tons of brick. "Not everything," Eleanor said. She walked over to me, her designer coat torn at the hem, her silver hair perfectly in place despite the carnage. She reached out and took the small key from my trembling hand. She turned it over, pressing a hidden seam on the side. The metal casing slid away, revealing a micro SD card nestled inside the hollow stem of the key. "Your father was the smartest man I ever employed, Sarah," Eleanor said, a trace of genuine warmth finally touching her eyes. "He knew that if he ever went missing, the vultures would go for the floorboards. He rigged the house with a demolition charge that would trigger if the case was opened without the proximity bypass, which was his way of ensuring that anyone who stole the documents would be buried with them. But he gave the real evidence to the only person he knew would never betray his memory." She handed the card to Uncle Silas. "This contains every digital ledger, every recorded conversation, and the full map of the offshore accounts Arthur and his cronies used to bleed this town dry. Your father didn't die of a heart attack, Sarah. He died because he was about to hit send on this file. But he made sure that even from the grave, he'd have the last word." Silas nodded to his team. "Get this to the federal processors. I want the warrants for the rest of the town council issued before sunrise." As the emergency lights began to flood the street, Mark approached us. He looked older, smaller, the golden boy's shine completely extinguished. He looked at the ruins of the house, then at me. "Sarah, I didn't know," he stammered. "I swear I didn't know about the money or the mayor. Tiffany told me you were hiding assets. She said—" "I don't care what she said, Mark," I interrupted, my voice flat and cold. "You chose to believe a stranger over the woman you spent 10 years with. You let her frame me. You let her humiliate me. You're not a villain, Mark. You're just nothing. You're a ghost." I turned my back on him, and for the first time in 18 months, I didn't feel the phantom ache of my failed marriage. I felt light. Tiffany tried to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse or plea for her brand, but Eleanor silenced her with a single icy look. "I'd save your breath, dear. You're facing charges of evidence tampering, conspiracy, and grand larceny. I doubt your followers will be allowed to visit you in a federal penitentiary." An hour later, as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, Eleanor and I stood by her car. The town was waking up to a scandal that would reshape it forever. "Why, Eleanor?" I asked one last time. "Why help me tonight? You could have let the mayor take me down. It would have been easier for the sterling name if I just disappeared." Eleanor leaned against the car, looking out at the smoking remains of the house. "Because, Sarah, I realized something when I saw that girl Tiffany standing in my ballroom. I realized that I had spent years being cruel to a woman of substance because she didn't fit my mold, only to watch my son bring a monster into our lives who had no mold at all. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. She handed it to me. I opened it to find the real sterling brooch, the $40,000 diamond shimmering in the morning light. The police returned it to Mrs. Sterling, but she's decided to donate it to your firm, Eleanor said. The Heritage Fund is being dissolved and audited. We're going to need a new library, a new community center, and someone with an eye for integrity to rebuild this town from the ground up. I looked at the brooch, then at the woman who had been my tormentor and was now my greatest ally. I'm not coming back to the family, Eleanor, I said firmly. I wouldn't dream of asking you to, she replied with a sharp, knowing smile. But I think you'll find that being a sterling ally is much more profitable than being a sterling wife. I watched her drive away, the silver car disappearing into the morning mist. I looked down at the micro SD card in Silas's hand, and then at the ruins of my past. My business was saved, my father's name was cleared, and the woman who tried to ruin me was in the back of a squad car. I didn't need a house or a husband to feel at home. I had the truth, and for the first time in my life, I had myself. I took a deep breath of the cold, crisp air, turned my back on the rubble, and started walking toward the future. It was going to be a long road to rebuild, but I already had the perfect design in mind.